The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Network Collective's latest webinar on the topic of 6 key steps for a successful. My name is John Waterhouse. I'm CEO of the Network Collective, and I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. As I'm sure everyone joining knows, TNC is the UK's largest independent network and telecom and sourcing consultancy. We support over 260 large UK and multinational companies to get the best commercial, technical, operational and contractual results from their network and telecoms transformations. So joining me today is our CTO, Craig Northweth. Craig, would you like to say hello to our listeners?
Yeah, hi John, and hello to the listeners on the call. My name is Craig Northweth. I'm the CTO here at Network Collective. I'm primarily responsible for the strategy development channel within the business. Works out along John and many of our consultants to deliver these capabilities to customers.
Fantastic, delighted to have you, Craig. So before we get stuck into the meat of the webinar, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. So we are going to be very strict on sticking to the 20-minute timetable. Everyone joining will have access to a recording of the webinar afterwards, and we will try to respond to any questions at the end, but any we don't have time to answer during the webinar, we will respond to you on email afterwards. Right, so let's start with some background on why we prepared this webinar for today. Until recently, most organizations considering the future of their networks talked about migration as they change from one network to another. But over the last 12 or 24 months, TNC has noted more and more organizations are talking about transformation. Now that might sound like just a change of word, but it's actually a huge change. The reason people are talking about transformation is because the role of the network itself is fundamentally changing, and therefore the approach those organizations are taking to achieve the goals with their network also has to change. So we're finding that network transformation now involves changes to every aspect of the network. There are no elements that stay the same. All parts are in motion. That means the technology, that means the provider, it means the service, it means the operating model, commercials, the contractuals, the whole piece. And given that the network itself is becoming an increasingly fundamental component of business operation, it is clear that the development of a network transformation strategy is now a very important initiative. In fact, we're seeing it often being a board level initiative in many organizations. So the purpose of this webinar is to deep dive into that question and in particular to look at the 6 key steps TNC's research is showing successful organizations are taking in developing their network transformation strategy. And in particular, we want to talk through a lot of the toolkit that TNC has been building around network transformation and how to achieve that success, and to provide you, our wonderful listeners, with some exclusive access to some of that toolkit. Now, just a quick bit of background, as I think everyone knows, TNC leads more network and telecoms transformations for more organizations than any other consultancy in the UK. So we've got more insight into what's really going on in the market. And critically, at TNC, we are entirely vendor independent. So we aren't trying to persuade anyone to go down any particular route or buy any particular technology or back any particular vendor. All we're trying to do is reflect what's really happening in the market, and crucially stripping out those sales and marketing messages from the vendors, which are so designed to muddy the waters. So, background done, let's get on with the analysis. Craig, look at this first slide, look at migration versus transformation. Can you talk us through what those key differences are?
Yeah, sure, John. So I think as you mentioned there, particularly what we've seen in the past, many organizations consider the network to be an environment which effectively is fairly static, and if you want to change it, it's predominantly in the past been a migration from supplier to a different supplier. That might drive out some cost, it might drive out some additional bandwidths, but historically it's been quite a static like-for-like replacement. What we've seen, and particularly as you mentioned, over the last 12 to 24 months, is actually a number of new change drivers that are coming into the mix, if you like. So these change drivers typically sit outside of the network. So primarily we'll talk about cloud. So applications being migrated away from local central provision to cloud provision. This changes a way in terms of organizations need to architect their network environments. The second change driver is users themselves. So users primarily are no longer or always based on net, if you like, or connected to a corporate network. So this is also forcing organizations to consider alternative architectures, alternative connectivity models, even alternative technologies and suppliers to deliver what is their kind of corporate backbone. So we are seeing more and more organizations focus on transforming the networks as opposed to just like-for-like migration of their environments and networks.
And presumably that means other parts of the network getting touched, which in the past wouldn't have been touched. You know, when organizations moved from frame relay to MPLS, the service boundaries, etc., didn't move.
Yeah.
Are you saying that what we're seeing now, because the complexity of the change and the criticality of the services is so great, we're starting to see other things like service boundaries, operating models, etc., change as well?
Yeah, and I think what's compounding that change is technical innovation as well. So we are seeing now, particularly within the network space, quite a lot of innovation around things like SD-WAN, increased use of internet as a service from a corporate backbone perspective. So we are seeing the way people architect, deliver, implement, and manage networks significantly changing, primarily because the technologies allow them to bring some more control in-house and maybe commoditize some of the services, which in the past has been quite difficult to do.
Very interesting stuff. Now, I know as we move on to our next slide, I know that TNC, we've been spending a lot of time, and I know you've been leading that effort, developing toolkit activity around some of this. So, it'd be great if you touch on some of those points as we go through these next couple of slides. So what we're seeing here, TNC has defined 6 key success factors for this network transformation journey that organizations are going on. I can see factor number 1, define your strategy. Do you want to talk us through what we're seeing here and again, what organizations are doing to be successful?
Yeah. So clearly, from a transformational standpoint, having a strategy and an end state to aim for is probably the biggest key factor in terms of success. So the way we engage with organizations, particularly around defining strategy, is a top-down approach. So we are very business focused. We ensure that requirements are defined in terms of agility, maybe acquisition, maybe around the workforce, particularly around applications that are being consumed at a business level. And we take that top-down approach in terms of developing lower level requirements around a solution, a service wrap, and obviously, as importantly, a commercial model as well. So we really utilize data that we've got from processes that we've run, also insight that we gain from the market, again, also through processes that we've run from RFPs, but also our own engagement with key vendors and key service providers in the market to really bring all that together and help organizations understand the strategic vision, but also, more importantly, the transitional steps to get to that vision.
Well, that's a great point. I'm glad you raised it. I know one of the things we talk about much more commonly these days is what we call mid-state outcomes. So for sure, any strategy is going to have an end state outcome, but given the complexity of a lot of these migrations, is it fair to say we're also, in many cases, defining mid-states?
Yeah, so very much so. Transformation is, whichever area you look at within IT, is always going to be complex. It's certainly very rare that a transformation is a big bang approach. Mm-hmm. It does need to have multiple phases. We often refer to them as near state architecture, end state architecture, and visionary architecture, if you like. And we build from strategic perspective key deliverables around each of them states or them phases. And obviously, as part of the strategy as well, we identify where benefits introduced, potentially where new risks introduced as well, and we look at opportunities around how we can mitigate some of that risk and deliver benefit quicker for each of the phases of the strategy.
Okay, that's very interesting. moving, changing gears a little bit, I guess, from the vision, getting into a couple of more meat and potatoes type activities. Get on top of your inventory. It sounds pretty obvious. I know a lot of organizations find this challenging. I know very few organizations actually do this. Is this as obvious as it sounds?
So it is as obvious as it sounds, but it's very, very important. We just talked there about various different phases in terms of the strategy, but one of the most important phases is actually understanding what you've got today, what that costs, what the terms of the contract, how you can effectively, if defined by the strategy, migrate away from them services, and what are the risks and associated exit clauses, etc., within contracts to do that. So again, looking at our capabilities in this space, we run a telecoms expansion management business. I'm sure you're aware, John, but we use the same the capabilities and resources, if you like, from that process to help organisations as part of the strategy development and transformation piece to really build an inventory. So clear view of what their services are. The life cycle of them services, the cost of them services, and clear approach to what day one looks like, effectively from a strategy point of view.
And I know we're going to talk later on about roadmaps and timelines and so on for these transformations. I know from personal experience, I'm sure you'd agree, this is one of those success factors that people hugely underestimate the time required.
Yeah.
Particularly in a multinational environment, particularly where there may be multiple vendors involved, building an inventory, getting access to all that underlying data, the contracts, the bills, the asset registers, et cetera, this takes months.
Yes.
People generally don't include any time in their roadmaps to do this. It always bites them.
It absolutely does. And, back to the first point around the strategy, any strategy in theory, to be able to execute it will require a business case, require some form of return on investment. If you don't have that inventory, you don't have that baseline of data, and you've not put the time and effort in to develop that, it's very difficult to actually sign off and approve the business case going forward. So it is a very important step. And yeah, you're absolutely right, it can take some time. Luckily, we've got people that can help in that space, and it's one of the key deliverables and one of the key tools, I guess, and important tools of the whole strategy process.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to success factor 3, target operating model. Now, this is a really interesting fact. 5 years ago, this wouldn't have been talked about in this sort of toolkit. Operating model, everyone knew what the operating model was. We did this and the telco did that. We're seeing a huge change in that space now, are we not?
Yeah, so again, if we focus on why are we seeing a change in this space, it's primarily due to the fact that the way organisations are sourcing their network services now. So we are seeing a breakdown of the single supplier model into multiple suppliers. We are seeing new technologies, as I mentioned, things like SD-WAN, and more orchestrated technologies being brought into networks these days that allow simpler management of the environment. So what we're seeing effectively is a service boundary shift is probably the best way to define this, where maybe more of the day-to-day operational stuff and policy-driven capabilities could be brought in-house, because the level of agility around change and operational management you get from that over and above a telco contract, for instance, is quite significant. But then the lower levels in terms of connectivity and the lower level operational stuff, break fix, etc., are being found out to maybe one or more different suppliers. And again, changes maybe between a domestic network and a global network. But yeah, regional model would be a good example, I guess.
I guess going back to the toolkit question, I know one of the things which we're very keen on here, and again, a lot of organizations sort of skip this stage, and it's critical, is building. You can't build the operating model without an understanding of current environments, so the volumes, metrics around change, faults, etc., building that, and then understanding how that then flows through into a resource model, people, locations, tools, that whole piece. There's a whole volumetrics around that, is there not?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of our strategy development process, we've got a phase called demand management, or demand analysis, sorry, and that really looks to all of these things. So how many incidents have been raised, how many changes do you make, how many requests come in, how many problems have you got, what's the resource capability to be able to deliver that both in-house and from a supplier perspective, and we map all that out into a very clear view of what's the demand and how that might change with the future strategy in terms of some of the near state and end state visionary architectures, and that allows us to then map potentially a more kind of virtual overlay in terms of an operating model.
And presumably that again has a big impact on strategy, has a big impact on business case. Yeah. We're going to talk about that in a second as we move on. We go to success factor 4, don't forget the commercials. But again, presumably this is around taking all of those feeds. You've got the strategy feed, you've got the technology feed, you've got the inventory and the current services and contract, you've got the demand analysis, so that you can map out that operating model. Presumably that's flowing down into numbers of FTEs and what's going to be done in-house, what's going to be done externally. All of that is going to create that business case and that commercial model looking forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if we look at where we're quite unique in this space in terms of the commercial aspect is we've got significant levels of insight from both a customer perspective, from the strategy process we run, the baseline activity that we develop, but also from the market point of view. So from the RFP process that we run, understanding obviously a basic level connectivity costs, service management costs, resource costs from the service market, but also from an internal point of view, allows us to really build quite a comprehensive commercial model at the strategy level without going out to market. So it gives the business case some teeth, if you like, in terms of what that could look like and how you would execute it ultimately.
I think that's really key. I know in many cases, for the strategy around networks is overly focused on the technology, which of course is a critical aspect to a network. Of course it is. But if you don't know how it fits into the commercial envelope, you don't know how it fits into the budget, it's not understood the personnel implications and all of these different activities, that's going to be a very difficult transformation to implement. It's going to be a very difficult transformation to get the CFO to align to, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an awful lot of activity in this to bring the whole organization on board with the strategy.
Yeah. I think increasingly, we are seeing periphery services that an opportunity, if you like, to consolidate, converge more cost, again, due to technology innovation. So an example would be, could you collapse WAN optimization? Could you collapse firewall security services into a longer term network transformation process and take out some indirect costs, if you like? So we do take a very quite holistic view to all the costs associated with managing and running the network.
Okay, very, very interesting. Success factor 5, we're talking, be realistic with your roadmap. And I think, we've touched on some of this already, for example, around inventory build. These things take time. They often take longer than envisaged. I know we very often get involved in projects where, one could even argue customers have left it too late to make a start. What do we mean by be realistic about your roadmap?
So there's a couple of elements of this. So one is, when do you start the strategy piece? The reality is it does take some time. As we mentioned already, the baseline exercise can take some time. It requires the correlation of lots of data. Building the strategy itself can take some time. Getting sign-off, business approval, etc., will take time. So typically we would generally recommend probably starting that process 2 years before the contract's up for renewal. Again, that will differ depending on the size of the estate, but it's a good point to start and develop that strategic vision, understand what the near-term, long-term architecture needs to look like and the sourcing approach around that. But in terms of the realistic pieces, these things do take time to roll out as well. So unfortunately, physical fixed connectivity in networks is always still required. We've not got to 5G yet, where the promised land and no more wires, but it always going to take some time to deliver out a global network or even a domestic network. So ensuring that you are completely realistic is a key step.
And I know one of the things our commercial consultants will always say is the earlier you are in your process, the more leverage you've got from a commercial perspective. The longer you leave it, the more the service providers will feel they've got a gun to your head and they have control over those negotiations.
Absolutely right. I mean, the longer you leave it, you absolutely lose leverage because the likelihood of going to market or doing something different lessens significantly. So it almost becomes you're almost forced to renew or extend. So yeah, having a vision, having a strategy, something to work against, particularly now in the new world where technology innovation is really driving a new approach. It's very important to have.
Okay. Our final success factor: resource your plan effectively. So I guess what we're saying here again is don't underestimate the challenge, the complexity, the resources. I presume what we really mean is this isn't something your network manager can do on half a day a week.
Yeah, absolutely that. So to summarize this really quickly, this is not a BAU activity. We've seen many organizations try to treat this as a BAU activity and fail.
Yes.
Both from a strategic development perspective, but also from actual delivery perspective. It does take time. Again, it's similar with the roadmap, ensure that resource allocation is in place, or outsource that resource allocation potentially, and look at finding an organisation that can deliver that for you. Very interesting.
Okay, we are running up against the end of our timeline. So if we try and conclude on this, I guess what we're saying is the complexity around what network change means has increased significantly over recent years. And therefore, effectively, what we're saying is organizations need to treat this transformation process with the respect it deserves, to give it the time, the resources to do it right and develop the right roadmap that the business can approve, the business can sign up to, and that can be implemented and the success measured. Is that a fair summary?
I think it absolutely is. So it is more complex, it is more challenging, but potentially the benefits are greater. So we are seeing more organisations consider transformation over and above just transition now because of the benefits are more aligned to what the business is trying to achieve, as opposed to just delivering a network to be a network. It's becoming, for a lot of organisations, a business application now, and driven by where the application is going, where the user is consuming it from.
Excellent. Okay, we've had a number of questions in. I'm conscious we are past our 20 minutes, so I'm just going to pick one question out. So there's one here around the strategy development process itself. How long would we recommend organizations need to set aside for that sort of strategy development process? Is this a kind of 3-month type of an activity? Is that a...
Yes. So I mean, typically we position this as a 3-month activity, and obviously we would work collaboratively with the customer to ensure that we can capture all the correct data. We go through a number of processes. We reference them as artifacts or get outputs from that process, which will sign off on the baseline, or sign off on the key requirements that have been defined. We will collaboratively look at options that are available as an approach. We will then go into a much lower level detail around defining what the target architecture and target approach from a technical, commercial and operational perspective would look like. And then at that stage, once that's approved, we've got the kind of near state, end state vision. We would then start building a very detailed roadmap of how to execute that strategy. So that end-to-end process typically it's around a 3-month process.
Okay, very interesting. Craig, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for everyone who sent questions in. We will respond to those after the webinar. Thank you, Craig, as always, for providing us with your very interesting insight. I think this really is a fascinating topic, and one which I suspect is going to come to dominate more of our time, and I'm sure also more of the time of our listeners. And finally, as you can see on your screen, if anyone would like to discuss the potential impact of these developments on your organisation, please do get in touch with us via our website. We'd be absolutely delighted to arrange one-on-one sessions to talk this through further. And on that note, thank you all very much for listening. And we look forward to you joining us again for our next webinar in 6 weeks' time.